Hello, I'm Joe Craven, Senior Director of English for NET, and I'm going to be walking you through some of the basics and the background for the Year 7 poetry scheme, People, Places, Power and Poetry. Now, in terms of the overview, a few big things to remember to start with. Now, the point of this session is, in essence, to ensure that you as a classroom teacher understand not just what you're teaching, but also why. It's based on the idea that you teach better and more effectively if you understand what's going on behind the scenes, the different threads to see and to pull at and to intertwine, interweave, and so on. That's why it's also crucially important to make sure that, as well as the lessons themselves, you looked at the medium-term plan, at the overview, which draws all of these things together. It's also why the knowledge organiser for this scheme is very, very useful, hopefully, in drawing out some of the key content. Now, a few key things just before we get going properly with the content of the scheme. One thing, in terms of poetry, any poem is just a piece of text, and it's a really key message to convey to our students. Poems are often scary for students and also for non-specialists. Ultimately, what we're doing through this scheme, as with any scheme in English, is building skills that transfer across all the areas of English, both literature and language. There are things that do make poetry a distinct and discrete genre, but the overwhelming majority of the analytical and interpretive skills that we apply build across all the genres and across all the topics that we study. So the poems here that we are studying are obviously in and of themselves worthy of study, but they're also vehicles, more importantly, for the skills. They're vehicles for the technical understanding and the procedural and methodological knowledge. What's important is not that the student knows each poem inside out and back to front, though it's lovely if they do. It's more that the poems themselves provide avenues for learning and for development of the topic and of the subject as a whole.
So let's talk a little bit about how the scheme fits in within the wider Year 7 curriculum. Now, for one thing, students at this point in the year have already studied the Shakespeare play in Year 7, which was A Midsummer Night's Dream. And what they're doing in this scheme is building on a lot of those skills from Shakespeare. So they're building on the poetry analysis, the ideas of versification, lineation, rhyme, rhythm, imagery, and so on. So there's continuity there with the skills. There's also conceptual continuity, some of those key ideas and themes that were being unpacked during the Shakespeare scheme. Ideas about power, powerlessness, about relationships, about the group and the individual, and so on. Now, it's also important to realise that the poetry topic, as with all the topics across the year, they're organised chronologically from Shakespeare at the start of the year right the way up to the modern day. And this scheme, the poetry, is quite an effective bridge then between the Shakespeare and forwards beyond this to the Victorian and the 19th century work. Skills are laid up also across the year in terms of how they transfer most effectively. So the Shakespeare skills, for example, transferring to the poetry, from the poetry then to the 19th century, from the 19th century poetry to the 19th century prose, from 19th century non-fiction prose to modern non-fiction, and from modern non-fiction to modern fiction and students' own writing of fiction and non-fiction. So there's transferability between each aspect of the curriculum throughout Year 7 that students are studying. It's also important to realise that the poems that we are using in the scheme are themselves organised chronologically, and they run from the earliest, which is Blake's The Poison Tree, which was written in about 1794, I think, through to the most recent poem, which is Out of the Blue by Simon Armitage, written in 2006. So they're useful then in terms of linking up this whole timeline of literature for the students. So leaping from the Elizabethans with the Shakespeare through to the Victorians with the earliest poetry we've got here, and then also tracking through to the 21st century. So it's useful for making connections and for helping students to see the timeline of literature, as well as the contextual, conceptual, and literary continuity from each aspect across all those schemes. It's also useful to think about how the Year 7 poems that we're studying track across this wider curriculum from Year 7 up to Year 11. Now, for one thing, as you'll notice if you look at the names of the poets, these are the same poets that the students will study when they get to GCSE in Year 11. What that means is that the context of these poets is relevant in understanding not just the poem they're looking at in Year 7, but also the poems longer term. They track through into Year 8, the same poets with different poems, and into Year 9 up to 11 with, again, the same poets but with different poems. Now, what that means is that those poems and these poets link them into the wider curriculum in terms of preparing them for GCSE and beyond. If, for example, you look at the role banners of the poems, which are in all our academies, you'll notice that the same poets are on there, and the context actually is the same as the context offered in the anthology in Year 7 and Year 8. There's also conceptual continuity with the poems, which means that the poems in Year 7 that we're looking at have some similar topics to the poems in Year 8 and in Year 9 to 11. So, for example, in Year 7, students study Arms and the Boy, which is the Wilfred Owen poem. They then move on to looking at Dulce et decorum est in Year 8. And then in Year 9 to 11, they look at exposure, and so on. So in Year 7, it's just a few of the poets. And then in Year 8, they're looking at almost all the GCSE poets. So they're building both the depth and the range, but there is continuity across there. And that's why it's important also to build in comparison between the texts, because the comparative skill at GCSE is absolutely vitally important. So we're building in those skills they need all the way through their school career, right up to the end of Year 11. And it does start in Year 7. Let's talk a little bit about thematic links as well. So we already mentioned the idea that we're tracking certain poets all the way through our students' school lives. There's also thematic links that go beyond the poetry into the wider literature side of things. And we'd also get links within the poems themselves and between the poems. So, for example, in terms of Shakespeare, looking in Term 1A, there's key themes such as power, control and authority. And on the screen, as you'll see from the medium-term plan, we have these set of key concepts, key themes, these 7 that run through all the things that we are studying throughout English. So in Year 7, Term 1A, Shakespeare, power, control and authority. But we also see that theme explored in poems such as Arms and the Boy, in Hawk Roosting, in Out of the Blue, and so on. In the Shakespeare, as a different example, we looked at conflict between people. And again, that's a theme we see explored in The Poison Tree, in The Right Word, and so on. There's a theme of society, which we've also seen in the poetry in terms of lines composed upon Westminster Bridge. There's a half-cast, The Right Word. There's the struggle for self-definition and identity, which links pretty much all the poems, and so on. So the themes that we set up in Shakespeare and started to explore and use some key vocabulary for also transfers then into the poetry and will transfer beyond that into the rest of the year. In Term 2A, looking at the Victorian literature side of things, the ideas of power, control and authority, the group and the individual, interpersonal conflict, society, self-definition. There's loads of overlap between those texts and the poetry text that we're doing here. Obviously, the Victorian texts also link beyond that into ideas about relationships, far more causality, appearance and reality, and that sort of thing. And those are linked in terms of this wider conceptual tapestry that we're weaving throughout this English curriculum in Key Stage 3. You'll also see on the medium-term plan there's a section for wider texts. And the idea is that these are obviously linked sections to balance our textual coverage. What that essentially means is that we're trying to avoid what I've taken to calling the whack-a-mole issue, which is essentially that you end up focusing on one topic and students improve in that topic, and that's wonderful. But while they're doing that, they forget everything they've already learned about all the other topics that we've done. I was trying to balance that out so that skills in the various areas we're looking at, all of those skills across the year, are building, accumulating, developing, interweaving, interleaving, and so on. And we're doing that here in this scheme, as we are in all our schemes, by making constant links to other genres and topics, just so they don't completely drop off people's radar, and also so that students can see and emphasise the transferability of skills and content between topics, so that this whole picture is building holistically. So in this scheme, what we're building in is opportunities for comparisons to drama texts, such as, for example, Sheriff's Journey's End, to A Midsummer Night's Dream, obviously referring backwards to Term 1A and the Shakespeare text. We're also looking at some of the lyrics in terms of modern, if not literature, then certainly modern culture, in terms of unpacking poetry and what poetry is. And there's examples, for example, from When I Fall by the Bare Naked Ladies, a very fine Canadian band, and also by Falling from Asher. There's also links to prose texts, including, obviously, Pat Barker's Regeneration, which is a fantastic novel and trilogy, and also to Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses. I'll obviously handle the title of that with care. The extract, though, still works. This scheme also builds in non-fiction texts and media texts. So we've got here, for example, Owen's Poetry Preface from Disabled and Other Poems, and also Sassoon's Declaration on the War, both of which are extraordinary texts for developing wider awareness, contextual and cultural understanding, and building into that sense of wider context, which I know also overlaps with history, as the soaps will demonstrate. So these things aren't add-ons, they aren't things to be ignored or skipped over and skipped past. They're fundamental to the whole scheme in terms of building skills, building compatibility and comparability, and so on. And ultimately what all these do is they enable us to be interleaving and interweaving throughout the work that we're doing. Another link across the wider Year 7 curriculum and the 7 to 11 curriculum is, of course, about the phased vocabulary, which again you'll see on the medium-term plan. Now, the idea behind this really is to work with vocabulary to address word poverty amongst our students, but also to build up their conceptual depth. By building vocabulary, we are providing them with a stock of words which allow them to have a much more nuanced, subtle, developed, deeper engagement with all the aspects of what we're doing, and that's crucial. So working with this vocabulary we're offering here is incredibly important, and really one of the fundamental parts of the whole curriculum that we're building. So what we have here is a set of vocabulary which is continuous across the scheme's topics and the years, and we're constantly using it and reinforcing it. Now they're all thematically organised, as you can see, with control, power, the individual conflict, and so on. And the vocabulary that's on this page has been chosen because these do link to some of the poems in the anthology that we're studying. Now, a lot of this vocabulary will also have been used in terms of looking back at the Shakespeare text, and will be then repeated and reinforced and applied, again and differently, and so on, throughout the other texts that we're studying throughout the year. There's also vocabulary here which links to primary school coverage. That's particularly important in Year 7. So words, for example, highlighted in red, like individual, difference, prejudice, aggression, community, identity, individual. These are all words that students have been taught, or at least taught how to spell in primary school. These are all part of the Year 5 and 6 spellings, I think, for those ones. So it's important also to make that link back to what they've done previously, so they see it as a continuous process of learning and development, and not simply this isolated, cut-off, pigeonholed topic. So the vocabulary, absolutely crucial to be constantly using that, constantly reinforcing that, and making sure it's part of everything that we're doing in this scheme. SOAPs are also an important way of linking the whole curriculum together, and also looking beyond English into other subjects, that have overlaps with what we do. Now, with this example, we have got both maths and history. In terms of maths, there are a couple of aspects which do link into what we do in English. One is about the use of Venn diagrams for comparison. And when we are comparing poetry, Venn diagrams can be quite a useful way of pinning down what those comparisons are and what the differences are. It's a useful visual method of organisation. Also, the aspect of formal analysis is quite useful as an overlap with maths. In terms of, when we dissect poems, we look at aspects such as rhyme schemes, stanza lengths, syllable counts. And those also link into the study of patterns and sequences in maths in quite a useful fashion. Obviously, poetry is very much about inspiration and interpretation, but there is also a formal technical aspect to it, and there's a bit of overlap we can do with maths on that one. In terms of history, it's perhaps a more obvious link, which is looking at some of the context of the poems. Now, there are aspects of the Victorians, for example, and looking at the Romantic poetry, for example, that we do, which does link to ideas such, to do with empire and so on, with history. Probably the most, the richest link to be making is with the First World War context, which links very neatly to the study of empire in Term 3A in history of Year 7, and also to the World War I topic in Term 1A of Year 8. So there's overlaps there to be made. Now, with some of them, we're linking to topics they've studied in other subjects, and that's wonderful. In some, we're setting up content that will be referred back to in other subjects. Either way, it makes links across the entire curriculum to show that they are learning holistically in that broader sense across all of their school life, and not just in one subject. It's mutual reinforcement which benefits everybody. Now, the medium-term plan, that brings us on to looking at phased content for Year 7. And again, this is a very, very important section. Now, what this is an attempt to do, as you'll know from looking at other schemes, is to try and track what students are doing across the different schemes that they do, to make sure that things aren't simply studied in isolation. They're building and developing and linking and interweaving across the whole year. So on the phased content, we have these three sections. There's the context, the terminology, and the technical aspects, and also these key concepts at the bottom. Now, the reason, of course, that we have got the Year 8 section alongside the Year 7 section is, for one thing, so that you can see where the learning is going. So with Year 7, for example, looking ahead to Year 8, and the importance of the authorial biography again and the views of the other. And there's aspects that can influence then how we discuss and how we learn about the Year 7 content. but it's also because it's about making links forwards and backwards. So with a very bright Year 7 class, for example, with one of those top sets that we have a lot of in NET, looking ahead to Year 8, looking ahead to the content, and we can refer forward to things as well. So why not introduce ideas about structure and juxtaposition and rhyme schemes and free verse and dramatic monologues in Year 7 if students can access that? It's fine to bring those things down. In the same way that in Year 8, for example, if students are struggling with Year 8 content, it's important also to look backwards at the Year 7 content and draw that in as well to what we're doing. So this idea of the phased content running across everything. Now, in terms of things like the authorial biography, for example, that's all about how we link to the text from the poet, looking at the poet and their life and how that's relevant. Now, it isn't always relevant, it isn't always possible to make those links, but with some of them it's very much enriching to our understanding of the poem to be able to do that. So, for example, looking at the life of Wilfred Owen very much colours then how we interpret and how we think about poems such as Arms and the Boy, and moving beyond that. There's also the idea of differing views of conflict and violence over time, and that links in usefully these ideas of multiple perspectives, the idea of also how views of texts and topics change at the time and also over time, which is an important one. And then, of course, as we said, these important bits of context about World War I, World War II, and modern conflicts, and that does include terrorism, which we can explore usefully off the back of poems such as The Right Word. We've then got the technical aspect of it as well, and we have this set of vocabulary right the way from writer and poet all the way down to inference, infer, imply, suggest, and represent. Now you'll notice that there's a very neat and almost complete overlap with the terminology that's listed on the Shakespeare scheme, medium-term plan, and that's completely deliberate. It's the idea that we are building our technical understanding through the study of these different topics. There are a few which are specific to poetry, and a few which are added for this second topic, obviously to build and deepen the understanding. But generally, it's about that continuous process of learning. Now, most of these should be very, very straightforward. The writer and the poet, what a poem is, for example, looking at different audiences and readers, the contemporary, the modern, and so on, social context, the narrator, perspectives, and you can read the list for yourself. Now, with all of these things, they're all also covered in some of those wider subject development sessions that are available through Route 1 and Route 2, through the various sources for the NET Staff College English project. Now, you may find, as I've already said, that some of this vocabulary is perhaps a little basic, and it's fine, of course, to look ahead to the Year 8 terminology as well. You've got to make links forward to that. Now, at the bottom of this section, there's also a box which is all about key concepts, and there's phased concepts. And these are things that move beyond the idea of basic context or terminology and technical aspects into kind of big ideas. Some of these are threshold concepts, if you've come across that term. And these are ones for Year 7, so the idea of the writer's intention, not just about what is the writer writing, but what are they trying to do? This conscious construction aspect, the idea that they're trying to achieve an end, and how do we see them doing that? What are the methods they are applying to achieve that end? The idea of analysing language to support meaning. The words aren't simply words to be interpreted literally. They're conscious choices that have been made, and how to unpack them, and how to explore the alternatives that could have been chosen, or the techniques that are embedded within them, and how analysing that language can help to deepen and enrich our understanding of the meaning that's conveyed. The idea of the destructive, abusive nature of power, and that's probably the key theme that runs across every text that we do throughout our entire 7 to 11 curriculum. The idea that power, in all its various forms, functions in lots of different ways, but that many of the impacts of it can be, as it says here, destructive and abusive, and the interpersonal aspects of that. The consequences of conflict is a key one, both socially and personally. Looking at the contrast and conflict between human and natural power is a major area as well, which we'll see again throughout our texts, and different forms of conflict, the military, the social, and the personal. So there are all things that you'll have seen a lot of already in the Shakespeare texts, but you'll find in these poems, and that also help us to link beyond the poems to future topics and to future years. Now, I thought it'd be useful to talk very quickly through the poems that we've chosen for this anthology, and do a little bit of flagging up of key things that you want to be spotting. Now, obviously, the best way to learn the poems is to teach them, realistically, is to run through the process of analysing and unpacking and comparing and discussing them with the students, and that really is the best way to really deepen and develop your understanding. Of course, there's plenty of resources online which can be accessed as well. All these poems are quite mainstream, they're quite well known. Now, in terms of the first poem in the anthology, which is A Poison Tree by William Blake. Now, William Blake, there's a bit of context, obviously, in the anthology, which is designed to set up some of those kind of key ideas. He's an early romantic, that's important, in terms of those ideas about interrogating religion, for example, his own religious faith, but the idea of also non-conformist, anti-establishment religious bent that he had, that are finding inspiration in nature and the natural world, mirroring and reflecting and helping to focus our understanding of human nature and humankind. The idea of exploring tensions between people and their wider social organisation and organisations is also relevant here as well. And there's all linked to the idea of him being a romantic with a capital R. Obviously, don't forget, romantic, nothing to do with love. It's a completely different meaning. In terms of the form of the poem, there's a few things to pick up on. The fact it's in quatrains, the organisation of it in that structure, which is quite a traditional form. The idea of being written in rhyming couplets. Again, it's quite traditional, but maybe possibly ironic in terms of the quite destructive depiction of relationships in the poem. In terms of symbolism and imagery, it's worth picking up on things like the tree as an image with that of growth and fertility, as opposed to poison and decay. That of the apple, when we think about those mythical depictions of apples, for example, but also the Garden of Eden, which is the classic. The idea of the apple is this symbol of corruption and temptation. There's various themes in the poem that you want to be picking up on as well. Obviously, responsibility, consequence, temptation, the inside and the outside in terms of the internal aspect of the self, and also the external depictions, and so on and so forth. So lots we can do with the themes there. Basically, with this poem, if we cut through everything, it's relatively accessible. It's not particularly complicated, although it is almost entirely metaphorical. But it's really good for developing technical understanding. This sort of an apparently simple poem, but useful when you take it to bits, you deepen and develop your understanding of how poems work. It links obviously forwards to London at GCSE, which is the Blake poem in the year 9 to 11 anthology. But it also links within the year 7 anthology to poems such as Lines Composed in the View of Nature, for example, and forwards to GCSE with poems like The Prelude, Storm on the Island, and the other nature poems that we work with. So Lines Composed upon Westminster Bridge is the second of our romantic poems, capital R, and it's by William Wordsworth, who is, if not the most famous poet in English, he's probably not far off. Certainly he'd always feature in the list of the top 5. Now, Wordsworth is very much the romantic's romantic. His poetry set the tone for many of the later romantics and encapsulates for many people what it is to be a romantic poet. This idea we have of the floaty-shirted, nature-obsessed poet sitting on a rock somewhere, composing poetry to trees. I mean, that is the idea, really, that comes from Wordsworth. Key ideas, of course, from the romantics that we see in his poetry, that are of nature, religion, society, the awe and wonder of the world and its influence on people. They're all there in Wordsworth's work, and they're here in this poem. In terms of the form, it's a sonnet, which is a 14-line love poem. And if you think forwards to poems in the GCSE anthology, Ozymandias, for example, is a sonnet. If you know your Shakespeare, Shall I compare thee to a summer's day, Let not the marriage of true minds, these are all sonnets. And it's quite a traditional, rather old-fashioned form for a poet such as Wordsworth to be using. Now, sonnets have a set of predictable rhyme schemes, and this one is one of them. It uses an ABBA, ABBA, CD, CD, CD rhyme scheme. So we have 2 quatrains, essentially, followed by a sestet. So it is, a fairly traditional sonnet form. Of course, it's not about love in terms of love of an other. It is, of course, about love of a place and love of the world. It's visually beautiful as a poem. I mean, it's hard to read it and not be quite struck, I think, by how vivid, how imaginative, how varied the description is. He is doing that classic poetic thing of painting with words, building up this poetic scape. That isn't a technical term, by the way. That's just me trying to explain what I'm thinking. So there's lots of work you can do with this on Wordsworth's description of place and how it impacts on him, on his use of the various kinds of image, of which I think they're pretty much all in there, personification, metaphor, and so on. It's useful in terms of comparison to the sense of place we get in a poem such as Hawk Roosting, or Out of the Blue in the Year 7 anthology. And obviously links forward to the GCSE poems, The Prelude, which again is the Wordsworth poem, but also to Blake's poem London, and that city comparison, or to the emigre, again, with the city and the impact of the place on the person. So quite a lot we can do with that as well. But yeah, really, really lovely poem, this one, quite vivid. And that brings us to Arms and the Boy, which is quite a contrast to Wordsworth's poem. It's very, very different, and the time is very different as well. So in terms of this being by Wilfred Owen, I mean, Wilfred Owen was a serving World War I soldier, as well as a poet, and he began to write poetry really as a way of dealing with his own psychological state and his emotional state as a result of the war. Early on, they were an attempt to simply kind of almost cathartically express his feelings for no other audience really than himself and one of his great friends, Siegfried Sassoon, who inspired him. And then later on, he developed this aim, this ambition to represent the reality of war through his poetry, and not as a consolation, not as anything other really than just an attempt to preserve the reality of the war and what it was to experience. Now, Owen died just before the end of the war, and so literally it was about a week before the end of the war. And there's an awful story about the idea that potentially his family received notification of his death as the bells were ringing to say that the war had ended. And Owen's poetry is often very, very deeply personal, and this is no, it is exactly that. It's a very, very personal feeling poem. Now, he's given us 3 quatrains, these 3 4-line stanzas. And in terms of the form, he's playing, as he does in many of his poems, with these quite uncomfortable feeling half rhymes. So blade and blood, for example, they don't rhyme, but they almost rhyme. There's an auditory resonance there at the very least, as there is with flash and flesh, heads and lads, teeth and death, apple, supple, heels, curls. They don't rhyme, but there's resonance there. So these half rhymes or ghost rhymes or trace rhymes, you'd also find them called. And think about the effect of that. He doesn't want this to feel neat and comfortable and nursery rhymish. This is meant to feel rather difficult, complex, complicated. It's meant to be an uncomfortable poem in some ways. There's lots of imagery work going on here, as there is with the Wordsworth poem and with the Blake poem as well. Loads to do with the personification of the weaponry. That's quite a rich vein to explore, if you'll excuse the unintentional link there in terms of imagery. There's a contrast between the individual and the war, and that's quite a useful one as well. But a group versus the anonymous individual, and how we see soldiers. Now, the depiction of the war and the view of the individual are both worth picking up. We get a power comparison, of course, with hawk roosting. The suffering of the individual can be linked to out of the blue, or with the right word. In terms of GCSE links forwards, obviously the obvious one is to exposure, which is Wilfred Owen's poem in the GCSE anthology. But also we've got poems like Bayonet Charge, for example. And that kind of thing. There's other poems we'll be looking at there. Remains, maybe War Photographer, something like that. Now, Hawk Roosting by Ted Hughes is a personal favourite, actually. Now, Hughes was one of the most famous poets of the late 20th century, and certainly when I was growing up, he was certainly one of the best-known poets, and was somebody with quite a profile in a literary sense. He was poet laureate until he died, and he's well known as a poet of nature and wildness, and not wildness in the sense of a romantic and a romanticised idea of nature, but the brutality, the kind of visceral, physical brutality of nature, and how it compares to people and influences people. Now, the poem is written in quatrains, obviously. They're not regular, though, and that's important. They do bounce around the 10-syllable mark, every line does, but not perfectly. There is some rhyming, feet and eat, buoyancy and me. We get internally rhymed a bit later on, as with flight and right. It's worth unpacking that, really, in terms of the effect. Also, there's a shift from the more traditional sorts of poem that we've seen early on in this anthology, through to more modern poetry here, where poets are playing with the conventions and playing with genre. And worth unpacking, why this effect, what's he aiming for, what's he trying to do. There's a very strong sense of an individual voice, a view of power, a view of the world, the depiction of violence and morality. These are all worth unpacking, along with the imagery used to describe them and the hawk and the world around it. Now, the perspective here is a very natural contrast to something like Out of the Blue, or even to lines composed upon Westminster Bridge. The idea of power and powerlessness, you could always contrast that with a poem such as The Right Word, or Half Caste even. In terms of GCSE, the link forwards is, of course, to Ted Hughes' poem Bayonet Charge, but there's also quite clear links to a poem such as Ozymandias and to others, thematically. And that brings us to the poem Half Caste by John Agard, which is one of the most entertaining poems in the anthology, although that's not to demean or to detract from the depth of what he's trying to convey. Now, Agard is an Anglo-Afro-Guyanese writer, so there's multiple heritages and influences coming through his work, and he uses his Caribbean roots and his lived experiences for his poetry, including the voice he chooses to write in. It's worth viewing this poem more or less as a performance piece, and it does work best out loud, and there's no shortage of recordings of him reading it. So on YouTube, for example, if you look for it there, you'll find that. It's worth it. He's quite striking in terms of his delivery. It's not one that's easy to replicate from a teaching point of view. Also, the poem is in free verse, as opposed to the more regular verse of the previous poems. There are occasional rhymes on Pas and Ras, for example, or Tchaikovsky Key and Symphony. There's a repeated use of phrases such as explain yourself to structure the poem, and we get these two short framing stanzas either side and these two longer stanzas in the middle. So structurally, there's some unpacking that could be done there with the effect that he's trying to achieve. Now, the whole poem is structured, of course, around sets of things that, when you mix them, create a whole picture. The comparison of images from the world, such as painting or music, and comparing those with the idea of a person being half caste, that if a person is mixed, it doesn't mean they are less worthy or less of a person. The personal perspective is worth unpacking, the voice both in terms of the perspective adopted and also the way that Agard writes the voice phonetically, along also with the idea of directly addressing the audience. It's quite not antagonistic exactly, but quite a confrontational, it's quite a direct poem in terms of the way he engages with his listeners or his readers. It's a good comparison with points of view from people in poems such as The Right Word or Out of the Blue, or the idea of being powerful versus being powerless in the same poems. There's also an interesting depiction of power, potentially, you could pair with a poem such as Hawk Roosting and the voice of the hawk in that poem. For GCSE, obviously the main comparison is to Checking Out My History, which is Agard's poem there. But there are others, of course, that we can also link to in terms of personal perspectives, in terms of voices, strength and weakness, the emigre, and looking forward with vocabulary and concepts for those. And that brings us to The Right Word. Now, Imhotep's Darker's The Right Word is one of the more challenging poems in the collection, but it's very worthwhile. There's a depth to it which is very much worth unpacking, and this beautiful view of language. In terms of Darker's heritage, she has very much a mixed heritage, as you'll see from the brief biography that I've written for the anthology. And that heritage gives her a view of outsiders, an understanding of outside perspectives, and a sympathy towards them, as well as an openness to the idea of multiple perspectives, the idea of divided selves and voices, of varied perceptions, and also of an outside view of language and the importance of language and how to unpack it and play with it and understand how it's used. Now, the poem is written in free verse, mixing 3-line stanzas, which we call tercets, 4-line stanzas, quatrains, and there's a single quintet, a pair of quintets, which are these 5-line stanzas. There's a mixture of questions and answers used to show the interrogation of the issue, and there's the repeated rephrasing of the question to interrogate the concept, and repeated rephrasing of that key statement that she's offering us. And what that means is there's lots of language we can pick up on there. The idea of the terrorist, the militant, the warrior, the martyr, and the nuances of those words, and whether they are synonymous or part of a semantic field, or whether there are differences. So really useful, again, for picking up the nuances of language, and some interesting vocabulary opportunities in terms of exploring students' vocabulary. There's obviously a lot of contextual detail we can link to this in terms of citizenship and current affairs. It's a poem that really prompts a lot of discussion and debate in a very, very healthy way. It's an obvious comparison to Half Caste in terms of identity as a theme, but also to Hawk Roosting, in terms of the individual and power, to the idea of innocence and victimhood, potentially, in Arms and the Boy, and so on. Now, for GCSE, Darker's poem Tissue is the obvious point of continuity, and it shares a lot of the same ideas about meaning, identity, and definition. But there's other poems, of course, that you could link it to and compare it to as well. And that brings us finally to Out of the Blue by Simon Armitage. Armitage is very much a modern writer. He's got interest in travel, in people, in perspectives, in different voices, and he explores those. And he's not scared to engage with some quite meaty social issues. He's a dryly witty Yorkshireman, if you ever meet him or see him presenting things. He's also a playwright, a presenter, and so on. So he's quite an interesting chap, I think, to engage with. Now, Out of the Blue, this part is from a longer poem. This is just an extract from it. There's a very, very good reading of it, actually, on YouTube, available at the point that I'm speaking here, by the actor Rufus Sewell, which is worth looking at. Now, Armitage is writing here from the point of view of the falling man who became famous after the attacks on the Twin Towers. And if you've seen any pictures of the Twin Towers, it's one of the ones that comes up pretty much every time, the chap falling off the tower. And that age-old question of, did he fall? Did he choose to jump? Can we ever know? And what, and how we interpret those things. And what Armitage is doing here is taking someone anonymous in that sense, and he's giving them a voice and exploring their perspective. Now, the poem is written in 4-line stanzas, and there's some play around with rhymes that are of burning and turning and waving and saving and watching and washing and driving and diving and so on. So he is using rhymes in a way that's quite interesting and worth picking up on and exploring. There's also a lot of repeated structures, the question and answer aspects, although really kind of question without answer aspects in terms of this isolated voice. The repetition that he uses, twirling, turning, waving, watching, leaving, diving, either of words or of synonyms of words. And it's giving them a sense of emphasis, but also this echoing effect of distance, about how far away this person is. There's loads of imagery to unpick. And it's a really interesting perspective, really interesting voice to engage with, the intimacy of the voice, and to our response as readers or listeners to that voice. It's a useful comparison to Hawk Roosting in terms of contrasting power and powerlessness, and choice as well. Potentially it's also one that could compare to, say, lines composed upon Westminster Bridge, or the right word as well. For GCSE, it obviously links to Armitage's poem Remains, neatly in terms of the individual, the voice, the sense of powerlessness, the language play, and so on. But again, there are others from that anthology that you could make useful links to. Right, and ultimately that's it. Each week in the scheme has got 4 lessons provided. The first lesson is generally one designed to bridge content from the previous week and introduce topics for the next week. There's lots of vocabulary work throughout the scheme, as you'll spot, in terms of often setting up the poems. There's a weekly assessment style lesson to work on the analytical writing side of things. There's some opportunities for creative writing built in during the scheme, and also a citizenship lesson provided as well, which draws on some of the key ideas from the scheme. Now you'll notice that there are 6 weeks provided, and that's based on the assumption, as happens every year, the work will overflow somewhat. There's always more you can do than there's time for. And also that there'll be disruptions to individual lessons. And it allows for some flexibility and for nudging things and playing around with things and spending more time on things and so on and so forth. Right, hopefully that's been useful. Hopefully you enjoy the scheme and enjoy teaching it. Hopefully you enjoy the poems. They are ones that are personal favourites from many of the director team. So hopefully you will. Thank you very much for your time, and stay well.